Our Speaker was elected the 34th United States Senator from Texas in 2012. His complete bio is printed in your program, but I want to note that in the short time he has been in office, Senator Ted Cruz has already become well known on Capitol Hill through his vigorous service on various committees, including Commerce, Science and Transportation, Armed Services, the Judiciary Committee, Special Committee on Aging, and the Committee on Rules and Administration. The Chamber is extremely honored to have the Senator with us here today in his first public address in the Dallas-Fort Worth area since being sworn into office. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Ted Cruz, U.S. Senator.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you so much. It is great to be back with so many friends here in North Texas. Much of my family lives up here in North Texas, and it's great to be home in a room full of Texans. You know, there's not much happening up in Washington right now. We are in the midst of one momentous occasion, that event known as sequestration. And in fact, in honor of sequestration, everyone's lunches have been reduced by 2.4%. You know, I must say, as I look out and see the look of famine, you know, it's really hard to imagine how anyone can sustain themselves on 97.6% of a meal. Indeed, the hollow look in Bill Sproul's eyes, it's reminiscent of Anne Hathaway in Les Miserables. You know, I have to say, the last 2.5 years have been an incredible journey. When we started my campaign for Senate, January of 2011, I was literally at 2% in the polls, and the margin of error was 3%. Which, if my math serves, means technically I could have been at negative 1%. And there wasn't practically a soul in the state that thought we had a prayer. And we saw an incredible team come together of men and women across the state of Texas who poured their heart and passion and energy into the campaign. And we ended up seeing a grassroots victory that stunned a whole lot of observers. And as a result of the hard work of so many men and women, I now have the opportunity to serve in Washington, where I have received such a very warm welcome. So thank you. You know, these are times of enormous challenge. Our country is facing enormous challenges, and I want to suggest 2 simple strategies for how we should go forward. Number 1, we should stand for principle. And number 2, we should champion growth and opportunity. Let's talk about standing for principle. The last few weeks it has been interesting to see a number of leaders in Washington doing something it seems hasn't been happening in a while. Standing for principle. Just a couple of weeks ago, I had the privilege of joining my friend, Senator Rand Paul, in what turned out to be a 13-hour filibuster on the floor of the Senate. I have to tell you, when Rand Paul began that, a lot of our colleagues viewed what he was doing as curious, if not quixotic. It began because the administration had refused to answer a straightforward question. Does the Constitution allow the U.S. government to kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil if that individual doesn't pose an imminent threat? Now, in my view, and I think in the view of most Americans, the answer to that should be pretty obvious. Absolutely not. And yet, over and over and over again, when asked, the administration refused to answer that question. So at 11:47 a.m. 2 weeks ago, Rand Paul went to the floor of the Senate and stood up to begin a filibuster. And what happened over the next 13 hours was really inspirational. we saw one person after another, different senators coming to stand with Rand. And we saw all over the country people captivated by standing for principle. That filibuster happened to be the first time I had the opportunity to speak on the Senate floor. There's a tradition in Washington that freshman senators give some reasonable time before they take to the Senate floor. That's a tradition I had been honoring until that battle was one that I couldn't see come and go without participating in it. And I will always owe Rand a debt, because the first time I had the opportunity to speak on the Senate floor, I was able to read Travis's letter from the Alamo. It so happened that that day was the 177th anniversary of the fall of the Alamo. And I read Travis's letter from the Alamo and observed to Rand that I had no doubt that if William Barrett Travis and Jim Bowie and Davy Crockett, the heroes of the Alamo, were alive today, they would have been standing shoulder to shoulder on the Senate floor. I had the opportunity to read the opening monologue from the movie Patton. I had the opportunity to read Shakespeare's St. Crispin's Day speech. And I had the opportunity to read Ronald Reagan's A Time for Choosing speech. As they say in the beer commercial, it don't get no better than that. And at the end of 13 hours, we saw standing for principle as one senator after another came to come together, and we started seeing House members come over. By the end of the night, it ended nearly 1 in the morning. There were probably 20 House members on the floor of the Senate, which doesn't ever happen. And as a result of doing that, the next day, the administration, in a letter, explicitly conceded the federal government doesn't have the authority to kill U.S. citizens on U.S. soil with a drone. Another example, I think, of standing for principle has been the leadership we've seen with respect to gun legislation. Now, right now, there are a number of folks in the Senate that are looking to pass major gun legislation. And quite a few of us have been endeavoring to say, listen, we should focus on violent criminals. We should focus on stopping violent criminals, preventing them from acquiring guns, preventing them from harming innocent citizens. But we shouldn't be restricting the right to keep and bear arms of law-abiding citizens. Now, I have to admit, Washington's an interesting place. So on the issue of gun rights, Vice President Joe Biden gave some interesting advice. He said, if anyone is threatening your home, just go outside with a double-barreled shotgun and fire 2 shots into the air, which is very helpful if you happen to be attacked by a flock of geese, or for that matter, a drone. But I can tell you, as a result of the leadership we've seen from a number of senators on the Senate Judiciary Committee examining the testimony that appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee, looking at the difference between targeting violent criminals and targeting law-abiding citizens, we've already seen publicly the majority leader say that the so-called assault weapons ban will not pass the United States Senate. And I intend to continue fighting to ensure we target violent criminals and we protect the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens in Texas and all across the country. One other example, Obamacare. I think it's fair to say I'm not a fan. In the last 2 weeks, I've introduced 2 amendments to defund and to repeal Obamacare in its entirety. Now, I have to tell you, when initially I told my colleagues I was going to do so, there were more than a few of them that were less than thrilled that we were fighting this fight. And yet, when we went to the floor of the Senate twice in the past 2 weeks, when the vote came down, we held every single Republican in the United States Senate unanimously 45 votes to defund and to repeal Obamacare. Now, why does that matter? That matters because of the second point that I'm going to suggest to you that we ought to be doing together. Championing growth and opportunity. I think every elected official should have 2 words tattooed on their hands: growth and opportunity. And they ought to be the focus of everything we are doing. I'll tell you, in my office, the number one priority of our office every day is fighting to restore economic growth. That's what everyone in the office is focused on every single day. You know, in the last 4 years, our economy has grown 0.8%. The only other period since World War II where we have averaged less than 1% economic growth is 1979 to 1983. The economy is gasping for breath. The main argument that I used for defunding Obamacare now, last quarter our economy grew 0.1%. If we want to solve any of the other problems we have, economic growth is the first step. If we want to see the 23 million people who are struggling to find work get back to work, we got to have growth. If we want to resolve the train wreck that is the balance sheet of the federal government and our out-of-control deficits and debt, we got to have growth. If we want to reform and save Social Security and Medicare so they remain bulwarks of our society for generations going forward, we've got to have economic growth. And in my view, that should bring people together. That should bring Republicans and Democrats together to work hand in hand. It is in everyone's interest to get our economy going again. And I'll tell you the 3 sub-priorities under growth, all of which are focused on growth, are number 1, finally getting our out-of-control federal spending and our deficits and debt under control. Number 2, fundamental tax reform, taking the enormous burdens and complexity of our tax code, simplifying it, reducing the burdens, and lowering the rates for corporations and for individuals. And number 3, regulatory reform, reducing the burdens of regulations that are falling upon each of you, that are killing jobs and making it harder and harder for small businesses to survive. You know, sitting here at lunch, Bill asked me, said, what can we, the Richardson Chamber, do to help what you're doing and to work together? And I made 2 requests that I would make of each and every one of you. Number 1, I would ask each of you to go back to your companies, go back to your employers, and ask, what are the 2, 3, or 4 federal policies, federal regulations that if modified or if repealed would make the biggest impact on your bottom line, would make the biggest impact on productivity and job creation? Because you can't fight everything at once. If you do that, you're not doing anything. You've got to prioritize and triage, and my interest is putting energy where there's the biggest bang for the buck. I want to ask 3 gentlemen from my staff, Bruce Redden, Michael Flushy, and Raz Schaefer. Can you all stand up? Bruce, Raz, and Michael. Michael is right there. So if you look at the 3 of them, the 3 of them work for you. All 3 of them are up here in North Texas, in Dallas, and in Fort Worth. And their job is to be your point of contact, to be responsive to you. And I would ask you, get their cards, reach out, get to know them, and pass on your insight in terms of the federal policies and regulations that would make the biggest difference for you. You guys can sit down now. Actually, Raz can't sit down. He doesn't have a chair. That's the first thing I would ask, is your insight on what would make the biggest difference in your businesses. The second thing I would ask is your help telling the free market story. I think one of the challenges we have right now is we don't do an effective job telling the free market story, telling how small businesses can generate economic growth, can lift everyone's condition. So I would ask for your help in terms of empirical data, in terms of specific evidence of the incredible opportunity free market policies provide, and also the sometimes senseless impediments that our government puts in the way. And I would ask for anecdotes as well, concrete stories that crystallize it. One of the things I view as one of my central responsibilities is helping tell that story. So I ask for your help in telling the story of your businesses and how you're struggling. And again, please reach out to Bruce and Raz and Michael to help get that information to us. You know, the second part of championing growth and opportunity is opportunity. And something I've advocated for a long time is what I call opportunity conservatism, which is the idea that every domestic policy should focus like a laser on opportunity, on easing the means of ascent up the economic ladder, on making it easier to reach the American dream. You know, if you look at the economic challenges we have right now, they're not falling uniformly on our population. We have 7.8% unemployment, but the unemployment rate among college-educated individuals is just 3.8%. Among people who've never graduated high school, it's over 12%. Among Hispanics, it's nearly 10%. Among African Americans, it's over 14%. Among young people aged 16 to 19, it is over 25%. The people who have been hit the hardest the last several years by the lack of growth in our economy have consistently been those struggling to climb the economic ladder. You know, today I have an op-ed in the Dallas Morning News, which I would encourage you to read if you have the time and the interest, on Obamacare, and talking about how the promises have not matched up to the reality. Obamacare was passed 3 years ago this past weekend. When it was passed, the President told Americans that by the end of the first term, the average health insurance premiums would drop by $2,500. In fact, in that same period, the average family's health insurance premiums have climbed. They have not dropped a penny. They've climbed $3,000. That's a $5,500 swing between what was promised and what's been delivered. We were told when this bill was passed that if you like your insurance, you can keep it. That has proven not to be the case. Right now, there are 14.8 million seniors on Medicare Advantage. Obamacare took over $700 billion from Medicare. And in the next few years, those 14.8 million seniors are expected to drop in half to 7 million seniors. 7 million seniors are going to lose their Medicare Advantage coverage. A large portion of those seniors are low-income seniors. 38% of Hispanic seniors are on Medicare Advantage. And the Medicare Advantage program is being decimated. If you're a young person coming out of school looking for a job, the impact of Obamacare is it's harder to find that job. The impact of Obamacare is if you do find a job, the chances of your getting health insurance are dropping precipitously as more and more small businesses are eliminating health insurance. And if you find a job, you'll also find it harder to work the hours you need. We're seeing businesses all over this country forcibly reducing the hours employees are working to below 30 hours a week because that's the threshold for the costs of Obamacare. So, the floor of the Senate 2 weeks ago, I read stories, for example, of fast food chains, which are often where people climbing the economic ladder get their first job, flipping burgers. That's where teenagers, that's where Hispanics and African Americans and people struggling to begin the search for jobs start. That fast food chains all over the country are reducing their employees' hours as a mandatory basis to 29 hours or less. I read a quote from a single mom in Oklahoma who had just been told her hours were reduced to 29. She had 2 kids at home. She said, look, I can't provide for my kids on 29 hours a week. That has been the impact of Obamacare. It's why I think we should delay it or repeal it, because if we want to fix these problems, we need to get the economy going. And the impact of the economy not going falls the most on those struggling to achieve the economic dream. That should be our focus over and over and over again. You know, on Friday, we had a marathon session in the Senate where we were there till 5 in the morning voting on the budget. And it was interesting, there were several amendments that passed. Now, they didn't go into law because the way the budget process worked, they passed the Senate, but they're not going to pass the House, so they're not going to become law. But let me focus on 2 in particular that really highlight what we ought to be doing and also what the challenges are. Number 1, over 70 senators voted to repeal the medical device tax that's in Obamacare. Now, that is a punitive tax that is hammering the medical device industry. We've seen as a result of that tax, the venture capital going to medical device new operations plummet precipitously. And actually, the story of how it got adopted is one of the least pretty stories of how politics works, because the medical device industry essentially didn't play ball as Obamacare was being passed, and they got hammered and punished as a result of it. So over 70 senators voted to repeal that tax. I think that's terrific. I voted for it. It's a destructive tax. It hurts jobs. It hurts growth. But you know what? It also highlights what's wrong with Washington. The medical device industry is still a relatively prosperous industry. They're able to employ armies of lobbyists who have big cocktail parties, can wine and dine senators, can make the case. And for a powerful industry with lots of lobbyists in Washington, they get the tax that burdens their industry voted down. What about the millions of small business owners? Right now, there are 2.3 million Hispanics who own small businesses. They don't have fancy lobbyists in Washington. They don't have anyone going to the cocktail party, and yet they're getting hammered by Obamacare. And I think it illustrates a lot of what's wrong with Washington. That politicians in both parties are a lot more responsive to the powerful corporate lobbyists than they are to the struggling mom and pop businesses that are getting hit with regulations, hit with taxes, it's making it harder and harder for them to survive. We need to be fighting for economic growth for everyone. We need to be fighting for economic growth, yes, for big corporations, but also to the single mom who's starting a business in her garage that's going to topple the next big corporation. The economist Joseph Schumpeter referred to what he called creative destruction. That process of entrepreneurial dynamism, that's what's made the United States the freest and most prosperous nation on earth. That dynamism in our economy, and that's what we need to be responsive to. A second vote that occurred is we had over 60 senators vote to finally approve the Keystone Pipeline. Now, I think that's terrific. I was proud to vote for it. And indeed, I've been proud to work with a bipartisan coalition of senators working to urge President Obama to approve that pipeline. But it's another example. You know, we held about a month ago a press conference with 10 senators, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, where we together stood and said, listen, this is a pro-growth policy that ought to be a no-brainer. It makes sense from the perspective of jobs and the economy. With a stroke of a pen, the president could allow tens of thousands of high-paying jobs to come into existence. It makes sense from the perspective of national security and energy independence. It makes sense from the perspective of tax revenue, as the new business and new jobs generate more revenue to pay down our debt, and it makes sense from the environment. And yet, as of today, it still hadn't happened. Now, that vote is an example both of a reason to be optimistic, an example of where we can get bipartisan cooperation on pro-growth policies, and also a reason for continued concern, because even though it was passed in the budget vote, Harry Reid still hasn't allowed a straight-up vote on a bill that would approve the Keystone Pipeline. My friend Sam Johnson would happily lead that fight and is leading that fight in the House of Representatives. We can pass it in the House, but it's got to come for a vote on the floor of the Senate in a context where it can pass and become law. So that's reason for both optimism and pessimism. I want to close with an observation that's just a personal observation. 10 weeks ago, I had the opportunity to stand on the floor of the Senate and take the oath of office. And as I stood there with my hand on the family Bible, I couldn't help but think back to 1957. That's when my father fled Cuba. He had been imprisoned, he'd been tortured, and he fled Cuba and came to Texas. He landed in Austin. He couldn't speak English. He was 18, had $100 sewn into his underwear. And he got a job washing dishes, making 50 cents an hour. The reason he got that job is he couldn't speak English. You didn't have to speak English to wash dishes. And I couldn't help but think of what my dad would have said if someone had come up to that 18-year-old kid washing dishes and suggested to him that 55 years hence, his son would be sworn into office as a United States Senator representing the great state of Texas. That would have been unimaginable to him. That would have been beyond anything that teenage immigrant could have conceived. And yet there was my dad sitting in the Senate gallery watching me take the oath of office. My dad is today a pastor in Carrollton. My father is here. Please stand, Dad. Also here is my Aunt Tia Sonia. Who lives in Plano, and she too fought and was imprisoned and tortured in Cuba and came here seeking freedom. And my cousin Bibi and her husband Marino are both here as well, if y'all would stand. When the Cubans arrive, we don't travel in small numbers. And we will be having a dominoes game afterwards. But you know, I have to tell you, my dad has been my hero my entire life. And yet what I find so incredible about his story is how commonplace it is. Every one of us in this room has a story just like that. We are all the children of those who risked everything for freedom. And that has been the key to the incredible success of the United States of America. That for centuries we have been a land where millions have come from all over the world risking everything. And there has never been a nation in the history of the world where so many with so little could achieve anything. That's the incredible promise of this country. It's the promise that inspires each and every one of us. And it's that promise, it's that opportunity for each of us and for our kids and grandkids to have a fair shot at the American dream that inspires every one of us to fight to make a difference in our state and our nation. And I will tell you, I am honored and humbled to stand shoulder to shoulder with each of you, making sure we preserve the American dream for the generations to come. Thank you, and God bless you.
I think because of time, we will not do Q&A.
We do have one question.
Okay.
All right, we do have time for one question, Senator. What has been your biggest surprise since becoming an active senator in Washington? 10
tempted to say it's canceled me it's inspired me to cancel my subscription to the New York Times. You know, I suppose that there are a number of things I could say, but let me highlight one, which is right now the Senate's not working. We've got enormous challenges in our country. We've got a national debt that's larger than our entire economy. And I think most Americans are tired of partisan bickering. They're looking for people to go to Washington, to roll up their sleeves and start fixing these problems. And at least so far, making that happen is challenging. I will tell a quick story. So week before last, President Obama came to the Senate to have lunch with the Senate Republicans. It's the first time he's done so in his presidency, and we were very grateful. We welcomed him. I had about a 2-hour lunch, a lot of back and forth. And I had the opportunity to ask him a question. And the question I asked him, I thanked the President for coming. I said, listen, we need to have a lot more dialogue. I hope these conversations are not just a one-time event, but an ongoing event as we work together to address the enormous fiscal and economic challenges in this country. And the question I asked is, I said, it seems to me that all of us, Republican and Democrat, should work together pro-growth policies. And my question was, are there specific concrete areas we can work together across the aisle to restore economic growth? Number one, on fundamental tax reform that widens the base, lowers rates, and doesn't raise revenue. And number two, on regulatory reform that reduces the crushing burdens that is falling on small businesses and entrepreneurs and aids job creation. And I will tell you, his answer was encouraging. His answer on both fronts, on tax reform, he pointed to one area he thought there could be some bipartisan cooperation, which was corporate tax reform, where he suggested that his administration supported corporate tax reform that broadens the base, that lowers rates, and that is revenue neutral, that doesn't raise revenue. If that's the case, if the administration is willing to follow through on that, then I think there is an area of real bipartisan cooperation, because there is certainly wide support among Republicans for fundamental tax reform, and in particular for having tax reform that encourages U.S. companies that have nearly $2 trillion overseas to bring that money back and invest it in new jobs and new production here. The second area that he suggested as an area of possible cooperation was regulatory reform, and what he said was that he and his administration are concerned about regulations where the costs substantially exceed the benefits. And he suggested the Senate forming a task force to identify those regulations and to work with the White House to eliminate them. Now, I will confess that his comments there were different from, I think, the conduct of the administration the last 4 years. But my attitude is very much what President Reagan said, which is trust but verify. And so afterwards I went out, we held a press conference, I relayed the conversation just about verbatim, and I said I am happy to take the President at good faith, to work with him. So we're beginning, number one, to work together on corporate tax reform to see if we can get that done. And number two, we're working to pull that task force together, and that's why I want your inputs and your advice to target in particular the most burdensome regulations. There is reason for some skepticism, but at the same time, I choose to be willfully naive and to believe that we can appeal to the better angels of everyone. And so it has been surprising to me how little that has happened so far, but at the same time, there are glimmers of hope that I very much hope will blossom into real productive endeavors that get our economy going and expand opportunity for those who are struggling the most right now. Thank you very much.